My parents called me the dumb one for the first time when I was 7 years old, and I want to tell you that I remember the specific moment with the clarity that you remember things that rearrange the furniture of your understanding of yourself. And what happened was that my sister Claire had brought home a drawing she had made at school, and my mother had put it on the refrigerator and had said that Claire was going to be an artist or a scientist or whatever she wanted to be because she had a gift. And then she had looked at the drawing I had made that same afternoon, which I had placed on the table beside Claire's. And she had looked at it for a moment, and she had said that some children were gifted and some children were dependable, and that I should focus on being dependable. And my father had nodded from behind his newspaper. And that was the first time, and it was not the last time. And by the time I was 12, I had stopped counting the times. And by the time I was 18, I had stopped feeling them in the way that you stop feeling weather, when you have accepted that it is the condition of the place you live and not a judgment on your character. Claire was 3 years older than me, and she was everything my parents had wanted in a daughter, which is to say, she was visible and confident and academically exceptional. And she moved through the world with the specific ease of a person who has been told, from the beginning, that the world was built to accommodate her. And she was not cruel to me in the direct way that some siblings are cruel. And she was cruel in the way that people are cruel when they have been taught that one person's abundance is simply the natural order, and the other person's scarcity is equally natural and requires no comment. And so she did not comment, and I did not comment, and we lived in the same house for 18 years. And the house was divided in the way that houses are divided when one room has all the light and the other room has learned to function without it. I became invisible. I want to tell you that I chose this and did not have it imposed on me because the distinction matters, and what I understood early and understood completely was that visibility in my family was a currency I had not been issued, and that trying to spend a currency you do not have produces only debt. And so I stopped trying to spend it, and I became instead a person who watched and listened and retained. And I sat in the back of every room I was put in, and I learned everything that was happening in the front, and I found that the back of a room is an extraordinarily good place from which to understand the front, and that the people performing at the front are almost always too busy performing to notice what the person in the back is learning about them. Claire graduated from her undergraduate degree 3 years ago, and my parents had treated that occasion as the most significant event in the family's history. And I had sat in the back at that ceremony as well, and I had watched, and I had not been asked to sit in the back at that one and had simply found my way there from habit. And because the back is where I have always been able to think most clearly, and Claire had walked across the stage, and my mother had cried, and my father had taken 17 photographs, and I had watched, and I had gone home, and I had not been asked how I felt about any of it. Today was Claire's postgraduate graduation. She had completed a master's degree at a university that my parents described to everyone who would listen as one of the best in the country. And they were not wrong about that. And the ceremony was held in a hall that was large and formal, and had the quality of a place that has been hosting significant occasions for long enough that significance has become part of its atmosphere. And my parents had arrived early to secure seats in the fourth row, which was as close as the ticketing system allowed. And my mother had turned to me in the car on the way in and had said that today was an important day for Claire, and that there would be people at the ceremony who mattered professionally and socially, and that she needed me to understand that it would be better for everyone if I sat toward the back and did not draw attention to myself. And I said that I understood, and I did understand. Because I had been understanding this my entire life. And I found a seat in the last row against the left wall where I could see the stage, and where the people in the fourth row were small enough that I could observe them without effort. The ceremony began at 2. I watched Claire walk across the stage at 2:47, and I watched my parents stand up briefly before being asked to sit. And I watched my mother take a photograph. And I watched my father put his arm around my mother, and I sat in the back row with my hands in my lap, and I thought about nothing in particular, which is something I have always been able to do in rooms where I am not required to perform. The man appeared at the end of my row. At 3:15, he was wearing a dark suit that was not a celebration suit and was a working suit. And he had the quality of a person who has arrived at a place because he has a specific reason to be there. And he came down the row, carefully excusing himself past the people seated between the aisle and my chair. And he crouched down beside my seat in the way that people crouch when they need to speak quietly in a public space. And he said my name, and he said it as a question, and I said yes. And he said that he represented a legal firm and that he had been trying to locate me for 3 years, and that my family had moved twice during that period, and that the correspondence his firm had sent had not been responded to. And he said my grandfather's name. He said William Asante. I said that my grandfather had died penniless. He said that he understood. I had been told that. Then he held out the envelope. It was thick, and it was sealed, and it had my name on the front in print. And he said that William Asante had been a man of significant means, and that I was his sole beneficiary, and that the estate had been held in probate for 3 years while they located me, and that I should open it when I was ready, and that his card was inside, and that he was available whenever I had questions. He stood, he excused himself, back down the row. I held the envelope in both hands. I looked at the back of my parents' heads in the 4th row. I looked at Claire on the stage, holding her certificate in the light. I looked at the envelope with my name on it, and I sat in the back row where I had always been put, and I thought about 3 years of correspondence that had not been responded to, and 2 house moves that had made me difficult to find. And a grandfather I had been told died penniless. And I held the weight of the envelope in my lap, and I understood that the back row had just become the most important seat in the building. The ceremony ended at 4:17, and I know the time because I looked at my watch when the final name was called, and I have always found it useful to know the precise time of things that matter. And I sat in my seat while the hall filled with the specific noise of 200 people transitioning from formal stillness into celebration. And I watched my parents find Claire at the edge of the stage, and I watched my mother pull her into an embrace that lasted long enough to be photographed by my father, and I watched Claire laugh, and I watched the 3 of them arrange themselves for more photographs, and I sat in the back row with the envelope in my lap, and I watched them, and not one of the 3 of them turned to look at the back row, and not one of them looked for me. And I want to tell you that this did not surprise me, and it did not hurt me in the way it might have hurt me at 7 or at 12 or at 18. And it simply confirmed what I had understood for a long time, which was that my absence from a room was indistinguishable to my family from my presence in it, and that this had once been a source of pain and had long since become a source of information. I stood up. I put the envelope in my bag. I walked to the side exit, and I pushed through the door into the afternoon, and the air outside was cool, and the street was ordinary. And I stood on the pavement for a moment, and I thought about where I wanted to be when I opened the envelope, and the answer was not here, and was not anywhere that required me to manage my expression for the benefit of people around me. And I walked 2 streets east to a cafe I had been to once before, and I found a table at the back, which is where I always find my table, and I ordered a coffee. And I sat down, and I placed the bag on the chair beside me, and I looked at it for a moment, and then I took the envelope out, and I placed it on the table in front of me, and I looked at it. My name was printed on the front in the clean typography of a professional firm, and below my name was a reference number, and below the reference number was the name of the firm, which was a solicitor's practice, with an address in a city I associated with nothing in my personal history. And I looked at all of this, and then I broke the seal. The envelope contained 4 things. The first was a letter from the solicitor, whose card the man at the graduation had placed inside, and the letter was dated 3 years ago, and had clearly been prepared as the covering document for a package that had been waiting for me since then. And the solicitor's name was Mr. Emeka Darko, and he wrote in the measured and specific language of a person who has been trained to communicate complicated things without drama. And he said that he was writing on behalf of the estate of William Kofi Asante, who had died 3 years ago, and that I had been named as the sole beneficiary of the estate in a will that had been executed 7 years before William's death, and that the estate had been held in probate since the date of death while his firm attempted to locate me, and that the attempts had been complicated by factors which he described in a separate document enclosed with the letter, and that he was glad the envelope had reached me, and that his firm was available to assist with whatever I needed. The second document was the estate summary. I want to tell you what was in the estate summary carefully, because I think the careful telling of it matters. And what it contained was a portfolio of 41 commercial properties across 3 cities, and a 73% controlling interest in a logistics and supply chain company that operated nationally, and the properties were valued at the time of probate at a figure that I read twice, and then sat with for a long time, and the company had a separate valuation that I also read twice, and the combined figure was not a figure I had ever seen attached to my own name. And I sat in a cafe at a table at the back, and I looked at the combined figure, and I drank my coffee. And I thought about a refrigerator and a drawing, and a woman saying that some children were gifted. The third document was the one Mr. Darko had referred to as explaining the complications in locating me. It was 2 pages long. The first page documented the attempts his firm had made to reach me over the 3 years since William's death, and the attempts were specific and dated, and they included 4 letters sent to my parents' previous address and 2 letters sent to the address they had moved to after that, and a phone call made to my father's mobile number, and an email sent to my mother's email address, which Mr. Darko noted had been read according to the delivery confirmation, but had not been responded to. And I looked at the date on the email confirmation, and the date was 11 days after William's death. And 11 days after William's death, my parents had known that I was the sole heir to an estate of the size described in the second document, and had chosen not to tell me, and had subsequently moved house. Twice. The second page was a legal note prepared by Mr. Darko's firm regarding the implications of the non-response to the correspondence, and it used the phrase deliberate obstruction, and it used the phrase potential interference with probate proceedings, and it used the phrase matters, which may require further examination. And these were phrases written in the careful language of a solicitor who had understood what the non-response meant and had documented his understanding in terms that would be available if they were subsequently needed. The fourth document was a personal letter. It was handwritten, and it was from William. It was 3 paragraphs long, and I will not read you all of it. But I will tell you what the third paragraph said, which was that he had watched from a distance for a long time, and that distance was the only option available to a man who had been pushed to the edges of a family by a son who had married a woman who sorted people into categories before she knew them, and that he had seen what category I had been put in, and that he disagreed with the categorization, and that the estate was his disagreement made legal and permanent, and that he hoped I would know what to do with it, and that he believed I would, because the people who are put in the back of every room are always the ones who understand the whole room best. I folded the papers, I put them back in the envelope, I placed the envelope in my bag, I finished my coffee. I sat in the cafe for a long time after that, and I thought about 11 days. And an email that had been read and not answered, and 2 house moves, and 3 years of letters that had not reached me. And I thought about a son who had told his daughter that her grandfather had died penniless, and who had known for 3 years that the grandfather had died, leaving her everything. And I thought about what the word penniless had been designed to do, which was to ensure that I never looked and never asked and never found the envelope that had been sitting in a solicitor's office with my name on it. Waiting for 3 years while my parents attended graduations and arranged seating charts and told me to sit in the back. I did not feel the thing that people expect you to feel in moments like this. One, I did not feel triumph, and I did not feel grief, and I felt something colder and more deliberate than either of those things, which was the specific clarity that arrives when you have been handed not just an inheritance, but an explanation, and the explanation answers every question you had stopped asking, because you had accepted the answers you had been given. And I sat with the clarity, and I let it settle into something useful. I was not going to tell them. Not yet. Not until the time was exactly right. And I was very good at waiting. I did not call my parents in the 48 hours after the graduation ceremony, and I did not text them, and I did not appear in the family group chat that my mother maintained with the energy of a person who believes that the performance of family cohesion is the same thing as family cohesion. And I went home on the evening of the ceremony, and I sat at my desk and I read the documents again from the beginning to the end, and I made notes in the margin of a fresh notebook in the way I have always made notes, which is precisely and without editorial comment, and just the facts in the order in which they existed. And when I had finished reading and noting, I closed the notebook and I closed the envelope and I went to bed and I slept well, because I have always been able to sleep well when a decision has been made, and the decision had been made in the cafe and was not going to change. I called Mr. Darko's office at 9 the following morning. His assistant answered, and I gave my name, and she said that Mr. Darko had been expecting my call. And I noted that because a solicitor who has been expecting your call is a solicitor who has been thinking about the situation. And I said that I would like to meet as soon as possible. And she said that Mr. Darko had held the following morning available in anticipation. And I said that was fine. And she gave me the address, which was a building in the financial district. And I said I would be there at 10. I arrived at 9:58. The building was the kind of building that exists in financial districts to communicate that the people inside it have been trusted with significant things for a long time, and Mr. Darko's office was on the 11th floor, and it had a view that I noted and did not comment on, and Mr. Darko himself was a man in his late 50s with the manner of someone who has delivered complicated news to people across a desk for long enough that he has learned to do it without either softening it or dramatizing it. And I respected that immediately, and I sat down and I said that I had read the documents and that I had questions, and he said that he had expected questions and that he had prepared for them. I asked him to tell me about the probate notices. He opened a folder on his desk, and he turned it toward me, and the folder contained a series of documents that were organized chronologically, and he walked me through them in order. And what they showed was this, which was that the first probate notice had been sent to my parents' address 11 days after William's death, and that the notice had been sent by recorded delivery, and that the recorded delivery receipt had been signed, and the signature on the receipt was my father's. and that following the signing of that receipt, no response had been received from my parents, and that a second notice had been sent 6 weeks later, and had also been signed for, and had also received no response, and that Mr. Darko's firm had subsequently attempted the phone call and the email, and that the email had been opened at 11:43 in the morning on the day it was sent, which was a Tuesday, and that after the email was opened, my parents had moved house within 90 days and had not provided a forwarding address to any party connected to the estate. I looked at the signed receipts. My father's signature is distinctive, in the way that signatures are distinctive. When the person who writes them has always believed their signature carries importance, and I had seen it on enough documents in my childhood to know it without being told whose it was. And I looked at it on the recorded delivery receipt, and I looked at the date, and I looked at Mr. Darko, and I said that I wanted to understand the legal position of a person who signs for a probate notice on behalf of a beneficiary, and then does not inform the beneficiary. Mr. Darko said that the legal position was not comfortable. He said that his firm had prepared a preliminary assessment of the conduct, and that the assessment used the phrase deliberate obstruction of probate proceedings, and that there was additionally the matter of a legal application that had been filed by my parents 8 months after William's death, in which they had sought to have me declared untraceable for the purposes of the estate, and had submitted a statement to the court claiming that my whereabouts were unknown, and that attempts to locate me had been exhaustive and unsuccessful. And he placed that document on the desk between us. And I looked at it, and I looked at the date, and I looked at my father's name on the application, and I thought about a man signing a recorded delivery receipt for a probate notice and then filing a legal application 8 months later stating that his daughter's whereabouts were unknown, and I thought about what the word untraceable was designed to produce, which was a legal pathway through which the estate could be redirected. And I said that I wanted to know where the redirection had been intended to go, and Mr. Darko said that the application had named an alternative beneficiary, and the alternative beneficiary was Claire. I signed the inheritance acceptance documents at 11:40 that morning. I signed them the way I sign things, which is without ceremony and without the performance of significance. And Mr. Darko witnessed the signatures, and his assistant witnessed the signatures. And Mr. Darko said that he would file the acceptance with the probate registry that afternoon, and that the estate would transfer to me formally within the standard processing period, and that his firm would be in contact regarding the portfolio management and the company directorship. And I said that I understood, and I thanked him, and I shook his hand, and I left. I want to tell you about Sunday evening. My mother had been planning Claire's graduation dinner since the ceremony was announced, and she had invited 14 people who she considered important, which was a selection of family friends and 2 uncles and a woman from her church, whose opinion she valued. And she had cooked for 2 days, and the table was set with the good china that came out for occasions that required the performance of prosperity. And Claire was at the head of the table in the way Claire was always at the head of whatever table existed. And the house smelled of the food my mother made when she wanted people to understand that she was a woman who provided abundantly for the people she loved. I had not been invited. I arrived at 7:15. I had a key because I had never been asked to return it. And I let myself in, and I walked down the hallway, and I stood in the doorway of the dining room, and 14 people looked at me, and my mother looked at me, and her expression moved through surprise, and then settled into the particular arrangement she used in social situations when something had not gone according to her plan. But she was determined to manage it in front of an audience. And she said my name, and she said, "Oh, look, who decided to show up?" And she said the quiet one, and she said she hoped I had not brought any bad luck to Claire's big night. And the people at the table did the thing that people at tables do when something uncomfortable happens in front of them, which is they looked at their plates, and my father said, without looking up from his glass, that if I was going to stay, I could make myself useful, and there were dishes in the kitchen that needed attention. I did not go to the kitchen. I walked to the table. I stood between my mother's chair and the chair of the woman from her church, and I reached into my bag and I took out the single sheet of paper, which was a photocopy of the estate summary from Mr. Darko's folder showing William Asante's asset portfolio and the total valuation, and my name printed at the top of the page as sole beneficiary, and I placed it on the table beside Claire's graduation cake, which was white and expensive and had her name written on it in gold icing, and I placed it face up, and I stepped back, and I said nothing. My father looked at the cake, then his eyes moved to the paper. I watched his eyes find the letterhead. I watched them read the name of Mr. Darko's firm. I watched his face do the thing that faces do when the body receives information that the mind has spent 3 years working to prevent from arriving. And what happened was not dramatic and was not loud and was the specific and total draining of the particular quality of confidence that my father had carried his entire life, which was the confidence of a man who believed he had managed a situation completely. And I watched that confidence leave his face in the time it takes to read a letterhead, and I watched what replaced it. And I stood in my mother's dining room beside the good china and the graduation cake, and I looked at my father, and I did not say a single word. I want to tell you about the 14 seconds after I placed the document on the table because I counted them. And 14 seconds is longer than it sounds when a room full of people is trying to understand what it is looking at and what the correct response is. And in those 14 seconds, my father looked at the letterhead, and his hands, which had been resting on either side of his plate, moved slightly and then stopped. And my mother looked at my father's face, and her expression changed from the managed social performance it had been wearing into something less controlled. And the woman from the church looked at the paper and then looked at me. And the two uncles looked at each other, and Claire looked at the paper and then looked at my father. And I watched all of this happen in 14 seconds. And I stood and said nothing. My mother reached for the paper. She picked it up and she looked at it. And I want to tell you that I do not believe she understood in that moment what she was looking at in its full dimension, and I believe she understood enough, which was that it was something that should not be on her table at this dinner, on this evening in front of these people. And she looked at me, and her face had the expression of a woman who has been managing a room successfully for 2 hours, and has had the management taken from her. And she said my name at a volume that was higher than the volume she had been using all evening. And she said that I needed to leave. And she crumpled the paper in her hand, and she said that I had always done this, which was come into spaces I was not wanted and make them about myself. And that tonight was Claire's night, and that I was not going to ruin it. And she pointed at the hallway, and she said to get out of her house. I looked at her. I looked at my father. I looked at Claire. I turned around and I walked down the hallway, and I let myself out the front door, and I pulled it closed behind me, and I stood on the pavement outside my parents' house in the evening, and I thought about another pavement and another evening when I was 7 years old and a drawing on a table, and I thought about what 14 guests at a dinner table were going to spend the rest of the evening talking about, and I walked to my car and I got in and I drove home. I slept well again. I have mentioned this before, and I mention it again because I think it is relevant, which is that I sleep well when a decision has been made, and when the execution of the decision has begun, and both of those things were true. And I woke at 6, and I made my tea, and I dressed in the clothes I wear when I am going somewhere that requires the room to understand immediately what it is dealing with. And I drove to the headquarters of the logistics company, which was a building on an industrial estate on the eastern edge of the city. And I arrived at 8:15, which was before most of the staff, and I introduced myself to the site manager who had been notified by Mr. Darko's firm the previous afternoon that a change of controlling ownership had been completed, and who looked at me with the expression of a person who has been told something significant is happening and is now watching it happen. And I said that I needed access to the contracts division and to the compliance records. And he said, of course. And he took me there himself. I spent 2 hours in the contracts division. What I found in 2 hours was what Mr. Darko had indicated I would find, which was a company that was operationally healthy and contractually well structured, and that had among its major clients a manufacturing and distribution firm whose contract represented a significant portion of the logistics company's annual revenue, and the manufacturing and distribution firm was my father's employer and had been for 19 years. And the contract between the two companies was the largest single contract in the logistics company's portfolio, and it had been renewed annually without interruption for 11 years. And the current contract period had 8 months remaining. I called the head of my new legal team. At 9:47, I said that I wanted a full compliance audit initiated on the contract with my father's employer. And I said that pending the completion of the audit, I wanted all active logistics operations under that contract suspended, and I said that the suspension should be communicated to the client through the standard compliance review protocol, which was a formal letter from the legal team citing regulatory review requirements. And I said that I wanted the letter sent before noon. The letter was sent at 11:32. My father arrived home at 2:15 in the afternoon. I know this because the man who lives across the street from my parents has a dog. He walks it too, and he told me later that he had seen my father's car come down the road faster than usual and park at an angle that was not my father's usual precision. And my father went into the house, and my mother called him, and called him Mom. Called the lawyer before my father had finished explaining what had happened, which was that his employer had received a compliance suspension notice from their primary logistics supplier, and that the suspension had shut down 3 of the company's distribution lines, and that his boss had called him personally, and that the call had not been a good call, and that the letterhead on the suspension notice was the same letterhead that had been on the paper at the dinner table last night, and my mother did not wait for my father to finish, and she called the family solicitor, whose name was Gerald, and who had been advising my parents on legal matters for 15 years, and who had been the person they had consulted when they filed the application to have me declared untraceable. And my mother told Gerald everything in the order that it came to her, which was not a coherent order. And Gerald listened, and then he was quiet for a moment, and my mother said, "Gerald," and he said that he needed her to listen carefully. He said that he had received a formal legal notice that morning from a firm representing the new controlling owner of the estate of William Asante, and that the notice outlined the conduct of the probate proceedings over the previous 3 years, and that the notice used specific legal language that Gerald said he could not minimize, and the language included the words deliberate obstruction and fraudulent misrepresentation and interference with probate. And he said that the signed recorded delivery receipts had been recovered, and that the email confirmation had been recovered, and that the court application naming Claire as alternative beneficiary had been recovered, and that his professional assessment of the situation was that they were facing potential criminal proceedings, in addition to the civil claim that the new controlling owner's legal team had indicated was being prepared. My mother said that Gerald needed to fix it. The lawyer's answer made her drop the phone. Gerald said that there was nothing to fix, and that the estate had transferred legally and completely to the sole beneficiary, and that the transfer was registered and irrevocable, and that the compliant suspension of the logistics contract was a legitimate exercise of the new owner's corporate authority, and that there was no legal mechanism available to reverse either of those things, and that his strong advice was that they retain criminal defense counsel immediately, and that they should not contact the new owner directly, and that he was sorry, and that there was nothing further he could do. The phone hit the living room floor. My parents sat in their living room in the house where my drawings had not been put on the refrigerator and where the good china came out for Claire's dinners, and where I had been told for 11 years that I was the dependable one, which was the word my mother had used when she meant the one who would not amount to anything, and they sat in the silence of people who had spent 3 years building a wall around something that belonged to someone else and had just watched the someone else walk through the wall as if it had never been there. I was at my desk when Gerald called my legal team. My phone showed me a notification from the logistics company's operations dashboard. 3 distribution lines suspended pending compliance review. I looked at the notification. I closed the screen. I went back to work. The days after the phone hit the floor had a particular quality that I understood from a distance rather than from inside. And the quality was the quality of people living in a suspended state, which is the state you live in when something significant has happened and the consequences have not yet fully arrived, and you know they are coming and you cannot do anything to stop them, and you are simply waiting inside the knowledge of what is on its way. And I knew my parents were living in that state because Gerald had told my legal team that they had retained a criminal defense solicitor, and because the criminal defense solicitor had made one attempt to contact Mr. Darko's firm to explore whether a resolution could be reached, and Mr. Darko's firm had responded in the way that firms respond when the answer is no, which is formally and briefly and without leaving room for a follow-up. I did not contact my parents. I did not contact Claire. I went to the logistics company headquarters every morning that week, and I sat with the operations team and the contracts team, and I learned the business in the way I learn everything, which is from the foundation up and without skipping the parts that are less interesting than other parts, because the less interesting parts are always where the structural decisions were made, and I found a business that was well run, and that had been well run for a long time, and that William had built with the same quality of patience that he had described in his letter as the quality he had recognized in me. And I sat in his chair in the office that had been his for 23 years. And I thought about a man watching from a distance and deciding what to do about what he saw. And I thought that we had been more alike than I had been allowed to know. On the Thursday of that week, I learned about the anniversary dinner. I learned about it not from my parents, and not from Claire, and from my cousin Adwoa, who had been invited and who called me on Thursday evening, and who said that she thought I should know that my parents were having their 30th anniversary dinner on Saturday evening at a restaurant in the city, and that she had been told when she asked about me that I had not been invited, and that the reason given was that I was going through a difficult time and that my presence would affect the mood. And Adwoa said this with the specific discomfort of a person who suspects they are relaying a version of events that does not match the actual events. And I thanked her, and I said I was fine, and I said I hope she had a nice evening. I also learned that my father's employer's chief executive had been invited as the guest of honor. My father had been working toward this dinner for months, and I knew this because Adwoa mentioned it, and because it had the shape of something my father would consider important, which was an occasion designed to demonstrate to his social circle that he was a man of consequence and that his professional relationships were with people of standing. And the chief executive's presence at his anniversary dinner was the centerpiece of that demonstration. And my father had been arranging it since before the graduation ceremony. And before the envelope and before everything that had happened in the week since on Friday morning, I called the chief executive's office. I called as the controlling owner of the logistics company, and I asked for a meeting. And the assistant said that the chief executive was attending a personal engagement on Saturday evening, but that he could make time beforehand if the matter was urgent. And I said that it was, and she said that he would call me Saturday afternoon. And he did, and we spoke for 20 minutes. And I told him that I was reviewing the compliance suspension and that I was considering the terms under which the contract might be reinstated and that I would like to discuss it in person. And he said that he was very glad I had called and that he was available whenever I wished. And I said that I understood he had a dinner engagement that evening and that coincidentally I had business at the same restaurant and that I could meet him there if that was convenient. And there was a pause, and he said that would be entirely convenient, and I said that I would see him there. I arrived at the restaurant at 8:47. The private dining room my parents had booked was separated from the main floor by a glass partition, and I could see the table from the entrance. And I want to tell you what I saw, which was my parents at the head of the table in the clothes they wore when they needed people to understand that they had arrived in life, and Claire beside my mother in a dress that was new, and 14 guests arranged around the table in the configuration of people who have been gathered to witness something, and my father's boss at the far end of the table with the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy all evening and has not been able to put it down. I saw him receive the text. I had asked my assistant to send it at 8:45, and the text said that the logistics company's owner had arrived at the restaurant and was ready to meet. And I watched the chief executive look at his phone, and I watched him stand, and I watched him say something to the table, and I watched the table look toward the entrance, and I walked through the door of the private dining room. My mother saw me. First, she opened her mouth, and I know what she intended to say because I know my mother, and what she intended to say was a version of what she had said on Sunday evening, which was that I needed to leave and that this was not my occasion and that I was doing this deliberately, and she drew the breath for it, and the chief executive stepped around the table and crossed the room, and he reached me before she made a sound, and he said my name. And he said it with the register of a person addressing someone whose significance he has spent a week recalibrating his understanding of, and he said that he was very glad to meet me, and that he was grateful I had been willing to come, and he turned to the table and he said that he wanted to introduce the owner of the logistics firm that their business depended on, and he said my name to the room. My parents looked at me, Claire looked at me, the 14 guests looked at me. I looked at the table with the good glasses and the anniversary flowers and the centerpiece my mother had chosen, and I looked at the chair that had not been set for me, and I looked at my father's face, which had the same expression it had worn on Sunday evening when his eyes found the letterhead, and I thought about a back row and a drawing, and the word dependable used as a consolation for a child who was not expected to amount to anything. I said good evening. The room was completely silent, and in that silence 11 years of being the dumb one settled into its correct position, which was the foundation of everything they were looking at, and the foundation of everything they were going to need. And I stood in the doorway of a restaurant I had not been invited to, and I looked at the people who had arranged the seating, and I said nothing further. I let the silence do what silence does when it has been prepared properly, which is everything. 6 months is enough time for the shape of a consequence to become fully visible. And I want to tell you about the shape of the consequence that followed the anniversary dinner, because I think it is important to describe it accurately and without embellishment. And the accurate description is this, which is that I did not pursue the criminal fraud charges. And I want to explain why I did not pursue them. Because I think the reason matters. And the reason was not mercy and was not forgiveness, and was the simple and practical understanding that criminal proceedings require a quality of attention that I was not willing to redirect from the work, and that the work was more important than the satisfaction of watching my parents answer formally for what they had done. And I had looked at the satisfaction available in that direction, and I had looked at the cost of obtaining it. And I had decided that the cost was not worth what it would produce, and I had instructed Mr. Darko's firm to close the criminal referral file and to focus entirely on the civil and corporate matters. And Mr. Darko had said that he understood, and I believed that he did the compliance audit of the logistics contract with my father's employer, completed in its own time and in its own way. And I did not direct it, and I did not interfere with it, and I instructed the audit team to apply the same standard they applied to every compliance review, which was thorough and without accommodation. And what the audit found was what audits find when they are conducted thoroughly and without accommodation on companies that have been operating inside a comfortable supplier relationship for 11 years without rigorous external review. And what it found was a pattern of billing discrepancies that had been present in the invoicing records for at least 7 of those 11 years. And the discrepancies were not small, and were the kind that acquire a specific legal description when they are presented to a court, and my legal team presented the findings to the company's board, and the board consulted their own legal team, and their own legal team told them what Gerald had told my parents, which was that the position was not comfortable. The settlement was reached in the 4th month. The terms of the settlement required the company to repay the overcharged amounts with interest and to restructure its supplier contract on terms that reflected the audit findings, and the restructuring reduced the value of the company by an amount that the financial press described when the settlement was announced as significant. And the restructuring also produced a reorganization of the senior leadership team. And my father's position was among the positions that the reorganization identified as redundant. And he was made redundant in the 5th month with a package that was smaller than he had anticipated, because the pension component of the package was calculated on the basis of his final salary, which had been adjusted as part of the restructuring. And he came home on a Thursday afternoon in the 5th month, and he sat in the living room of a house that was mortgaged and that contained a will that named my sister as the heir to an estate that was now worth considerably less than it had been worth on the evening my mother had crumpled a piece of paper at a dinner table and told me to get out of her house. Claire's life adjusted in the way that lives adjust when the financial infrastructure supporting them is removed, and the adjustment was not gentle, and was the kind of adjustment that requires a person to discover what they are capable of when capability is the only currency available. And what Claire discovered was that she was capable of less than she had been led to believe. And I say this not with cruelty and with the specific accuracy of someone observing a situation from a distance, and I observed from a distance because distance was what I had, and I did not close it. My father called me on a Tuesday evening in the 6th month. I was at my desk, and I saw his name on the screen, and I let it ring twice before I answered. And when I answered, his voice was the thing I want to describe most carefully, because it was not the voice he had used at the dinner table, and was not the voice he had used looking at his shoes on a Saturday in October, and was not any voice I had heard from him before. And what it was a voice that had been emptied of the quality that had always powered it, which was certainty. And what remained when certainty was gone was something quieter and older and more honest than anything I had heard from him in 32 years of being his daughter. He said my name. I said yes. He said that things had become very difficult and that he was calling because he did not know who else to call, and that he was not calling to argue and was calling because he needed to ask something. And I said that he could ask, and he said that he wondered if there was anything I could do to help them. And he said help in the vague way that people say help when they mean money. And he said also that Claire was struggling, and that if there was any position at my company that might suit her, he thought the structure would be good for her. And he said the word structure with the specific sadness of a man who has recently learned what the absence of it feels like. I said that I appreciated him calling. I said that all professional inquiries, including supplier applications and employment applications, were handled through the firm's standard portal, and that the address was available on the company website, and that response times were currently 4 to 6 weeks, and that every application was assessed on its merits through the standard review process. And I said that I hoped he and my mother were well. He said my name again. I said that I had to get back to my work and that I wished him a good evening. I ended the call. I stood up and I walked to the window and I looked at the city, which was doing what cities do in the evening, which is continue. And I looked at the logistics company building 2 streets north, whose lights were still on, because the night operations team was working, and I looked at the commercial properties in my portfolio, whose addresses I now knew the way. I know the contents of the documents I read, which is precisely and completely. And I thought about a graduation hall and a back row and a seat against the left wall. And I thought about what you can see from the back of a room when you have stopped trying to be seen from the front. I thought about 11 years of being called the dumb one. I thought about what 11 years of being underestimated actually produces in a person who decides to use it correctly. And what it produces is not bitterness and not the desire for the specific satisfaction of confrontation. And what it produces is an education in the way that rooms work and the way that power moves through them, and the way that the people performing at the front are always too busy performing to notice what the person in the back is learning. And I had learned everything, and I had waited, and I had built, and the building had gone as high as it had gone, not despite the back row, and not despite the dumb one. And because of them, and because of every year of weather, I had learned to move through without arguing with it. Silence was never my weakness. I want to say that clearly as the final thing, because I think it is the most important thing, and what silence was, and what it had always been, was the condition under which I could hear everything, and understand everything, and prepare everything. And the people who had mistaken my silence for absence had made the same mistake that people always make when they confuse the person who is not speaking with the person who has nothing to say. And I had always had everything to say. And I had said it in the only language that lasts, which is the language of what you build and what you own and what you decide. The city continued outside the window. I went back to work. If you believe that justice was served in absolute silence, then leave a comment below and tell me which part of this story stayed with you the longest, because I read every single one. And if you are sitting somewhere right now being told that you are the quiet one or the dependable one or the one who will manage fine, I want you to know that the back row has the best view in the building, and the person who underestimates you is handing you the most powerful advantage available, and you only have to decide what to build with it. And if this story gave you something today, a like takes 2 seconds and helps this reach the person who needs to hear it next. And if you are not yet subscribed, please do it now, because every story on this channel is built on the same foundation, which is that silence kept correctly is not the absence of power, and is power in its most concentrated and most patient form. And I will see you in the next story.